She was already across the room when he saw her. He had been in the middle of a sentence, something about the northern trade routes, something a count to his left had been pressing him on for the better part of 20 minutes. And then his sentence simply stopped. Not trailed off, stopped, the way a clock stops when the mechanism inside it finally exhausts itself, clean and total and without warning. The Count continued talking. Somewhere in the ballroom, a quartet was attempting a gavotte with more ambition than precision. 1,200 candles burned in the chandelier above the marble floor, and none of it, not the Count, not the quartet, not the 1,200 candles, was in any way real to him anymore. She was wearing gray. Not the fashionable gray of the season, the silvered, shimmer-threaded gray that half the women in the room had chosen. This was a quieter gray, like river water before dawn, like the hour just before a thing is decided. Her hair was dressed simply. She held a glass she had not touched, and beside her, arranged with the practiced calm of a woman who has learned to carry a great deal without appearing to carry anything at all, she held herself in a manner he recognized with an accuracy that was almost physical. The particular straightness of her spine that meant she was managing something. The slight angle of her chin that meant she was prepared. He also noticed, because he was, beneath everything, a man who noticed things, and because it was not a thing that could go unnoticed, that she was very, very visibly expecting a child. Or rather, children. The word arrived in his mind some seconds after the fact, delayed by the way a sound travels across a cold lake before reaching the far shore. Not a child. Children. The proportions were wrong for one, and he had grown up in a household managed by a physician father who had believed that an educated man ought to know the difference between the ordinary and the exceptional. She was expecting more than one child. She was expecting, and here his mathematical mind, which had always been a liability where feelings were concerned, began to perform calculations he had not authorized. More than two. The Count was still talking. He said, "Pardon me," and crossed the room. Rowena Ashford. She was Rowena Ashford again. Had been Rowena Ashford for the 14 months since the decree had been quietly, decorously, and with great mutual dignity finalized, did not see him coming. Or if she did, she gave no sign of it, which amounted to the same thing with her, and which had always been the essential difficulty with her, and which was, he had begun to understand only in her absence, the thing about her he had most admired. She was speaking to a woman he did not recognize, something low and even, her free hand resting with the unconscious precision of long habit over the upper curve of her abdomen. Then the woman she was speaking to caught sight of him approaching and did something with her expression that was technically neutral and practically a warning flare. And Rowena turned. Her eyes met his. She said, "Edmund?" "Not, Your Grace." Not a formal address. Not the careful, calibrated social greeting of two people who had once been legally bound and were now merely acquainted. She said his name the way you say a word you have been rehearsing, when it finally becomes necessary to say it aloud, and you find, to your distant surprise, that it comes out steady. He said, "Rowena." He looked at her. She looked at him. The quartet worked through their gavotte. He said, and he was aware, even as he said it, that it was not the correct thing to say, that there was no correct thing to say, and that the only options available to him were various species of the incorrect, so he chose the one that was at least honest. "You did not tell me." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "No, I did not." He waited. She did not elaborate. This, too, was familiar. There are men who, confronted with an enormous piece of information, delivered without context in the middle of a ballroom, will press and demand and grow loud. Edmund Vane, the 8th Duke of Casterly, was not among them. He had his father's stillness, or had learned it, which amounted to the same thing in practice, and he stood in the middle of the floor while the candles burned above him, and the question he needed to ask arranged itself inside him slowly, the way sediment settles in still water. He said, "How many?" It was not quite a question. His voice did not rise. Rowena's hand moved, just slightly, against her abdomen. Not a flinch, a recognition. She said, 4. The word landed between them like a stone dropped into a well. Clean, certain, and then a long, long way down before anything came back up. 4. He had made calculations, and his calculations had suggested a number, and the number he had arrived at and then dismissed as implausible was 4. And he had dismissed it because the mind, in moments of genuine shock, is a cowardly instrument and prefers to negotiate toward the less extraordinary. 4. He had a physician father's education, and the particular curse of a precise man confronted with imprecision. And he stood there, with 4 settling into him like a season changing, gradual and total, and irreversible. The woman beside Rowena had found a reason to be somewhere else. Edmund said, "When?" Rowena said, "March." The physician says March, though he has amended his estimate twice, so I hold it loosely. He said, "Are you well?" The question surprised her. He saw it, the fractional opening of her expression, the nearly imperceptible moment before she recovered the composure she had been wearing since she turned and found him there. She had expected something else first. She had perhaps prepared for something else first. The accounting, the legal geometry, the long and inevitable conversation about what this meant for lineage and title, and the terms of an agreement that had been drawn up in good faith by lawyers who had failed to anticipate this specific contingency. She had not expected, "Are you well?" She said after a moment, "Yes." Remarkably, and against considerable early evidence to the contrary, yes. He said, "Good." And then, because the ballroom was not the place, and because he was a man who had learned, slowly and too late, and in the particular schoolroom of her departure, that the essential transactions of a life could not be conducted in rooms full of people pretending not to watch, he said, "Would you sit with me?" "Not here. There is a library." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "I know where the library is." Of course she did. It had been her house too, once. The house they were standing in belonged to the Earl of Fenwick, whose wife had been a friend of Rowena's long before she was anything to Edmund, and Rowena had attended more evenings in this library than he had probably read more of its books, had almost certainly organized at least one of the charity reading committees that had been held in it on Tuesday afternoons in the winter of the year before the decree. He had forgotten this. He forgot a great many things about her that came back to him now at inconvenient velocity. He said, "Then, will you?" She considered him. Whatever calculation she was running, she ran it behind a face that gave him nothing, which was both maddening and, he found, a relief, to be back in the presence of a person who did not perform their thinking for an audience. She said, "Yes, for a little while." The library was down a corridor hung with the Earl's unremarkable ancestral portraits, and smelled of old paper and the particular cold specific to rooms that are heated insufficiently and used infrequently. Someone had left a lamp burning on the central table. Rowena sat in the chair closest to the lamp, which was the sensible choice for light and also, he understood, the defensive choice, because the lamp was between her and him, and she had always, in disagreement, preferred to have something between herself and the thing she was disagreeing with. A table. A considered silence. The entire architecture of polite restraint. He remained standing. He said, "I want to understand." She said, "That is a broad ambition." He said, "Rowena." She looked at the lamp. Then she said, "When I understood what was happening, what the nature of it was, how many, I had already signed the agreement. We both had. The ink was dry and witnessed. And I had given back the ring, and you had." She paused. "You had been very correct about everything. Very thorough. Very fair." He said nothing. Fair was doing considerable work in that sentence. She said, "I did not think you would want to know, in the way one is told things one must then respond to. I thought—" She stopped. She began again. "I was afraid that if I told you, the conversation we would have would be about obligation, about what was owed, about the title, and what happens to children of a former duke and a former duchess, and whether the decree holds, and whether there are legal questions that need to be—" He said, "Stop." She stopped. He said, "Is that what you thought I would do?" She looked at him. She said very precisely, "Yes." The lamp flickered. Outside, distantly, the quartet had moved on to something that might have been a minuet. He said, "You were wrong." She said nothing. He said, "Or perhaps not entirely wrong. I do not know what I would have done 14 months ago, Rowena. I would like to say that I would have handled it with perfect grace. And I suspect I would like to say that because perfect grace is easier to claim in retrospect than it is to actually—" She said, "Edmund." He stopped. She said, "There is no version of this conversation in which I do not know that you are a decent man. I know you are a decent man. I have always known that. The problem," and here her voice did something quiet, something she controlled immediately and efficiently, but not before he caught it. "The problem was never whether you were decent. The problem was whether decent was enough." He sat down. Not across from her, in the chair adjacent, so that the lamp was not between them anymore. He said, "And now—" She said, "And now there are 4, and it is February, and I am sitting in a library in a borrowed house with the man I used to be married to, and I have not yet had the nerve to eat anything, because the smell of the supper room was—" She stopped. She almost smiled. It was brief and involuntary and immediately corrected. But he saw it, and it landed in him like the first light through a window you have kept shut for a season. She said, "The smell of supper rooms has been something of a complication." He said, "I will have something brought." She said, "You cannot have something brought. This is not your house." He said, "The Earl owes me a favor." She looked at him. She said, "Does he?" He said, "Several, actually." She said, "That is remarkably useful." He said, "I have occasionally found it so." They sat for a moment in the qualified silence of 2 people who have remembered, at the same time and without arrangement, that they know how to be in a room together. It was not a comfortable silence. It was not meant to be. It was the particular silence of a conversation pausing to let what has already been said settle into the stones of the floor, to test whether the ground holds. He said, "I would like to know." about the four of them. Whatever you know at this stage, whatever the physician has told you." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You want to know?" He said, "I have been very specific about wanting to know for the last several minutes, Rowena. I would prefer to not have to establish it a third time." Something in her expression shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone watching from the doorway, and no one was watching from the doorway, but the habit of accounting for it was deeply lodged in both of them, would have characterized as significant. But he was not watching from the doorway. He was adjacent to the lamp and 6 inches from her, and he had spent the better part of 3 years learning to read the small seismic information of her face. And what he saw was something releasing, the way a door releases when the latch finally disengages. Quiet and barely audible, and total. She said, "There are 2 boys and 2 girls. The physician believes, though he has been wrong about most of his specific predictions." He said, "What is he right about?" She said, "March. And that they are all, as far as he can determine, stubbornly healthy." He said, "Stubbornly." She said, his word, "I thought it was apt." He said, "It is very apt." He paused. Then, "You will need." And here he stopped himself, because the sentence he had begun was in the genre she had feared, the genre of obligation and accounting, and it was not what he meant, even if the practical content was correct, and he was trying, with the concentration of a man learning a new language in the middle of a conversation in which he was already expected to be fluent, to not lead with what was practical. He began again. He said, "I would like to be there. In March. If you will permit it." She was very still. He said, "Not because of, not for any reason about what is owed, or what is correct, or what the lawyers would recommend. I understand that there would need to be conversations of that kind, and I am prepared to have them, and you may have whatever provisions you require, and I will agree to conditions that are entirely yours to set. But I am asking you, separately from all of that, as a thing that stands on its own and requires its own answer, whether you will permit me to be present." The lamp held its flame. The library held its cold. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because they are mine." He said it quietly, without emphasis, the way you say a thing you have known for some time and are only now admitting you know. "Because they are mine. And because you are—" He stopped. He said more carefully, "Because you are the person in this room who has been carrying this since August, alone, and I was not present for that, and I cannot recover the months I was absent, but I would like to not continue to be absent." Rowena looked at the lamp. She looked at her hand, resting over the place where 4 small, stubborn lives were conducting their own quiet negotiations. She said, "You left." He said, "I know." She said, "We left each other. But you were very decided about it." He said, "I was afraid." The word sat between them. He had not intended to say it. He had spent 14 months arranging the events of their marriage into a narrative where decisions had been made carefully and mutual, and with full information by 2 adults who had arrived at a reasonable conclusion. And the word "afraid" had not appeared anywhere in that narrative. and it appeared now with the irreversibility of something that has been true all along and has simply been waiting for the right room, the right lamp, the right angle of a woman's chin to become sayable. She said, very quietly, "Of what?" He said, "Of being insufficient. For the particular person you are. You were. You are." And here language failed him in the way it always failed him with her, because she had always been slightly ahead of his ability to accurately describe what he meant, and he had never worked out whether that was a flaw in him or a quality in her, or simply the nature of being in proximity to someone who exceeded your available vocabulary. He said, "You are quite a lot of person, Rowena." She said nothing. He said, "I did not know what to do with quite that much person. I kept thinking I was managing it adequately and then finding evidence that I had not. And eventually He stopped. He said, "I made a decision that I understood at the time as sensible. I understand it now as something I should not have made." She looked at him. Her eyes were, he would not say bright. She would not want him to say bright. She would prefer a word that did not announce itself so openly. Her eyes were doing something careful and unresolved, which was accurate and which was hers. She said, "You should have told me you were afraid." He said, "You were very composed about everything. You always appeared entirely—" He searched for it. She said, "I was terrified the entire time." He stared at her. She said, "I was terrified from the week after we married until the week the decree was finalized. I was afraid every single day that I was—" She chose her words with the deliberateness of a woman who has had a long time and considerable privacy in which to locate the accurate ones. "That I was something that was difficult to stay adjacent to. That I asked too much, thought too clearly, managed too thoroughly. That I was a great deal of person, as you say, in a way that was more burden than—" She stopped. She said, "I was never composed. I was performing composed." He looked at her. He said, "For 3 years." She said, "One learns." He said, "Rowena." She said, "Edmund." Outside the library, the evening continued its elaborate performance. The quartet had found their confidence in the minuet and were now flourishing in it. The Earl of Fenwick's other guests were eating the supper that smelled of things Rowena could not currently consider without consequence. The Count, who had been discussing trade routes, had found someone else to discuss them with, and was probably, Edmund thought distantly, perfectly satisfied with the substitution. He said, "I am going to say several things, and I would ask that you allow me to reach the end of them before you decide how you feel about them." She regarded him. She said, "That seems like a request designed to protect you from an interruption that you have earned." He said, "Yes, entirely. And I am making it anyway." She said after a moment, "Continue." He said, "I am going to speak to my solicitor in the morning. There are things about the decree that, given the current situation, will need to be addressed. You do not need to worry about provision. You did not need to worry about it before. I was always going to ensure it, regardless of our situation. But I am saying it now so that you may set it entirely aside, and it need not be a thing you carry." He paused. "That is the practical portion." She said, "And the other portion?" He said, "I would like to call on you." in a context that is not a borrowed library at a bowl neither of us particularly wanted to attend, in a context where we might, he was very careful here, very deliberate, with the particular slowness of a man who has been wrong about a large thing and has resolved to not be wrong about the next thing out of haste, where we might speak to each other regularly as people who are going to know each other for a very long time. She was quiet. He said, I want to be clear. I am not suggesting anything that would require you to agree to more than that. A conversation. More than one, perhaps. I am suggesting only that two people who are going to share 4 children and possibly the next several decades might benefit from having somewhat more information about one another than we currently have. Rowena looked at her hand again. She looked at him. She said, You know a great deal about me. He said, I know a great deal about the version of you that was performing composed. I would like to know the other one. She sat with that. The lamp burned. He did not press her and did not fill the silence because he had learned, in her absence, slowly, in the particular school of things you understand only when they are no longer available to you, that her silences were not vacancies. They were work. She was doing something in them, and interrupting them was a specific species of discourtesy that he had committed too many times in too many rooms that were no longer available to him. She said, at last, You may call on Tuesday. He said, Tuesday. She said, I have the physician on Monday, and I am reliably unsociable on Mondays thereafter. He said, Tuesday is entirely acceptable. She said, I cannot promise anything beyond the conversation. He said, Tuesday and a conversation is more than I had when I came into this room. She looked at him. She said, It is more than I expected to have when I came to this ball. He said, Why did you come? She said, Fenwick's wife is a dear friend and has been exceptionally good to me these months, and I could not refuse her, despite the supper room situation. He said, I came because Fenwick holds my promissory note for a card game in November, and thought it would be amusing to require my attendance. She said, Was it not amusing? He said, after a moment, I have not decided yet. Something changed in the room. It was nothing visible, nothing that would have registered to any instrument designed to measure the observable. The lamp burned the same. The cold was the same cold. Outside, the quartet finished their minuet and began something slower and more deliberate, something that seemed to understand the assignment better than anything else had managed all evening. And Rowena Ashford, who had been carrying an enormous thing alone for 6 months in a gray dress that was the color of river water before dawn, almost smiled at him. Not the involuntary fraction of earlier. This was a considered smile, a deliberate one, the kind you allow when you have decided, in full possession of the relevant information, with both eyes open, that the risk of it is acceptable. He felt it in his sternum. He had always felt her in his sternum. He said, Shall I have something brought? Before we return. You should eat something. She said, The rolls are usually safe. Not the fish. He said, Not the fish. She said, The fish was a catastrophe in October. He said, I will ensure there is no fish. She said, Edmund. He said, Rowena. She said, Thank you. She said it simply, without elaboration, without the careful armor of all the other things she said, and it landed in the room the way the truth lands in rooms. Small and plain, and heavier than anything dressed up to resemble it. He went to find the Earl and collect on one of the several favors owed to him. And when he came back, she had leaned back slightly in the chair and closed her eyes, and her hand was resting with the same unconscious precision over the same curved place. And she looked, for the first time since he had seen her across the ballroom, and his sentence had stopped, like someone who was not managing anything. Like someone who was simply, temporarily, in a place that was safe enough to stop. He set the rolls on the table beside her lamp and sat back down and did not say anything. And she opened her eyes after a moment and took one without looking at him and ate it with the focused dedication of a woman for whom bread has recently become a matter of profound seriousness. And he watched the candle on the table burn down 1/4 of an inch, and neither of them spoke. And it was the best conversation they had ever had. He called on Tuesday. The house she was renting was in a quiet square on the east side of the city, chosen, she told him, for the absence of stairs between the ground floor and the garden, which had seemed theoretical in August and had become intensely practical by December. The housekeeper, a compact Welsh woman named Mrs. Perry, greeted him at the door with the particular assessment of a woman who has heard a great deal about a person, and has strong opinions and has decided provisionally to suspend them. He was given tea. He was not given the good biscuits, which he noted and accepted as the correct degree of reservation. Rowena was in the sitting room by the window, with a book open and unread on her lap, and the expression of someone who has been sitting very still and thinking extremely loud thoughts. She looked up when he came in. She said, "You're punctual?" He said, "I am always punctual." She said, "You were once 40 minutes late to our own dinner party." He said, "The horse had opinions about the weather." She said, "The horse had opinions." He said, "Strong ones. I respected them more than I should have." She looked at him for a moment. She closed the book on her lap. She said, "Sit down, Edmund." He sat down. Mrs. Perry brought the tea. She did not bring the good biscuits. He was given plain ones, which were, he decided, a step above nothing, and possibly also a test. They talked for 2 hours. Not about the decree, not about the solicitors, not about the 4 people currently conducting their own negotiations in the vicinity of Rowena's constitution. They talked about the book she had been failing to read, which was A Natural History of Migratory Birds that she had purchased in September with optimistic intentions. They talked about his northern estates, which had been badly managed in his absence, and were now being restored with the help of a steward who had very strong opinions about drainage, which Edmund found he respected. They talked about Mrs. Perry, who had come to Rowena through a recommendation and had turned out to be not only an extraordinarily competent housekeeper, but an amateur authority on medicinal herbs, a combination that had proved invaluable in the context of the October fish situation. At one point, Rowena said something dry and precise about the natural history book's author's theory of navigation, and he laughed. Actually laughed. Not the controlled social version. And she looked at him with the expression she had when something happened that she had not quite calculated for. And then she did something he had not seen her do in the last year of their marriage. She laughed too. Quietly, without correcting it. He called the following Tuesday. He called the Tuesday after that. By the 4th Tuesday, Mrs. Perry produced the good biscuits without remark, which he took as a meaningful development and said nothing about. The solicitors exchanged letters. The legal geometry was addressed. He signed what needed signing, and she signed what needed signing, and the result was a set of arrangements that her solicitor called highly unusual, and that Edmund considered merely accurate. He did not say this to her solicitor. He said it to Rowena, who said, "Your solicitor seemed quite flustered by the whole thing." He said, "My solicitor is frequently flustered. It is his most endearing quality." She said, "Is it?" He said, "It humanizes him considerably." She said, "I see." And then, looking out the window at the square where the trees were beginning to hold a pale suggestion of March in their branches, "Edmund." He said, "Yes." She said, "You should know that I have thought about what I said in the library, about performing composed." He waited. She said, "I would like to try the other thing." She said it carefully, the way you say a thing you have rehearsed and then decided to say unrehearsed because the rehearsed version was too defended. She said, "I am not very practiced at it, but I would like to try." He said, "I would also like to try." She said, "You were always less composed than I was." He said, "I was a disaster, Rowena." She said, "You were honest," which I found alarming at the time. He said, "And now?" She looked at him. She said, "Now it seems like something I might be able to find useful." He said, "I will attempt to remain alarming." She said, "I would appreciate it." And she gave him the full smile this time, the considered and deliberate one, and it was different in the afternoon light of a sitting room with good biscuits and a Welsh housekeeper, and the trees going pale outside with the approaching month. Different in the way that a thing is different when it is chosen rather than arrived at, when it is decided rather than discovered. Warmer and less fragile, and entirely his. The four arrived in the latter half of March, on a Thursday, during a brief and optimistic window of early spring sun that was gone by noon, but that Mrs. Perry would insist on referencing for the rest of her life as a sign, regardless of anyone's opinion about signs. The physician was present. Edmund was present. Mrs. Perry was present in the hallway with a thoroughness that made her absence from the room a largely technical distinction. They came in two pairs, with a determined and workmanlike efficiency that the physician said, afterward, was the most organized thing he had witnessed in 30 years of practice, which seemed to Edmund perfectly consonant with their mother. 2 boys, 2 girls, all 4, as promised, stubbornly healthy. He sat in the chair by the window, a different house than the library and the borrowed lamp, but the same man and the same woman, and the same lamplight quality of careful light. And Rowena, who was exhausted in a way that was beyond the vocabulary he possessed for exhaustion, looked at him across the room with 4 small people arranged in the vicinity of her and said, "Hello." He said, "Hello." She said, "This is rather a lot." He said, "It is quite a lot, yes." She said, "I find I am not afraid of it." He said, "No." She said, "Are you?" He looked at the 4 of them. He looked at her, he said with the honesty he had promised her, and which had turned out to be, in practice, both more difficult and more necessary than he had initially understood. "I find I am not." She said, "Good." He said, "I agree." The Earl of Fenwick, when he heard the news, sent a letter with the observation that his promissory note ought now to be considered discharged in full, given that compelling Edmund to attend the ball had demonstrably served the greater public interest. Edmund wrote back that the Earl's accounting was, as always, characterized by a generosity toward himself that was almost admirable. The Earl found this delightful. They remained friends. The physician retired from active practice the following winter, citing his nerves, though those who knew him suspected it was the Thursday in March that had accelerated his timeline. He took up watercolor painting in the countryside and produced work that was, by all accounts, competent. The Count, who had been discussing trade routes in February, completed his negotiations without Edmund's input, arrived at a satisfactory arrangement, and never thought about the evening at the Fenwick ball at all. He is not the point. Mrs. Perry remained with them for 11 years. She brought the good biscuits from the second Tuesday onward, she confirmed to Rowena, once they were all properly settled and the question was raised. She had simply been making a point. Rowena said, "And the point was?" Mrs. Perry said, "That I was watching." They understood each other perfectly from that point forward, which is the correct way to understand Mrs. Perry and possibly the correct way to understand most people. The four grew into the kind of children who are described by neighbors as a great deal of character, which is accurate and also a slight understatement, because the proportions in them were remarkable. The boys with Rowena's precision and a fearlessness that was, Edmund thought, entirely their own. The girls with his quietness, and underneath it a quality he recognized slowly, with the particular surprise of finding something in a place you have always been but never looked, as joy. Plain, unconcealed, elected joy. He did not know where they had found it. He suspected they had simply decided to have it, the way you decide things when you are new enough to the world to not yet know you were supposed to be afraid. The Tuesday calls continued. They did not, technically, need to continue. The legal arrangements were resolved, the households combined by the autumn, the decree set carefully aside by two solicitors who exchanged a look of mutual professional relief. But they continued anyway. Tuesday mornings, by the window, with the good biscuits, and the book of migratory birds that Rowena eventually finished and pronounced satisfactory, and the particular quality of conversation that exists between two people who have decided, in full possession of the relevant information, both eyes open, to stop performing and start. It was not always comfortable. It was not always graceful. There were Tuesdays that were difficult and Tuesdays that were ordinary, and a handful of Tuesdays that were, in the quiet and interior way of things that are genuinely good, the best hours of the week. He had been afraid, he had told her, of being insufficient for the particular person she was. He spent the subsequent years discovering that insufficiency was not a fixed condition. It was a distance. And distance, given Tuesdays and honesty, and four people who had arrived in the world determined to be entirely themselves, was a thing that could be closed. She let him close it. That was the thing, the real thing, the thing underneath all the other things. She had been carrying everything, and she had been afraid, and she had been composed in every room for 3 years running. And when he came across a ballroom and stood in the lamplight of a borrowed library and said, "I was afraid," she had let herself put down the composition. She had let him see the fear underneath it. She had decided, in the chair by the borrowed lamp, that the risk was acceptable. And she had been right. She had been right the way she was right about most things, which was thoroughly and without fanfare, and with a steadiness that wore better than almost anything else in the world. They learned each other. The other version, the real one. They were not the same people who had signed the decree. They were not the same people who had performed their respective compositions in room after room and called it a marriage. They were, instead, the people underneath those people, more difficult and more accurate and more possible, and in possession of 4 stubborn children and 1 small sitting room window that looked out on a square where the trees did what trees do every year, without being asked and without requiring anyone to remark on it. Which is to say, they kept returning, If you have ever carried something enormous alone and expected to keep carrying it, and been surprised by someone who turned out to be worth the surprise. If you have ever sat in a cold library with a lamp between you and a person you were not certain about, and chosen, against the available evidence, to put the lamp to one side, then you will know what it felt like to be Rowena in that chair, and why she took the role he brought her, and why the fact that she did was the most significant thing that happened in that house all evening. The moment of being seen is rarely loud. It rarely announces itself. It arrives in the form of someone asking, "Are you well?" when you expected them to ask about the accounting. It arrives in the form of plain rolls and the good biscuits on the second Tuesday, and a man sitting very still in a chair while you close your eyes, because he has learned, finally, that your silences are not vacancies. They are work, and the work is worth waiting for. If that is a feeling you recognize, then this story was for you. I am glad you found your way here, and I am glad you sat with it. Come back when you need a quiet room and a lamp, and someone to tell you a true thing slowly. There will always be a chair by the fire, and there will always be another story, and you will always be welcome.